Hey everyone, welcome to today's lesson. Today we're going to be talking about appropriations, or how the government spends their money. So what are appropriations? Appropriations are when the government spends money on a specific program for a specific reason. So we know that the government is here to help solve problems that exist within our country. One of the ways that the government solves those problems is by creating programs designed to specifically tackle a certain issue. And the government decides on where to spend money on each of those programs, right? Just dependent on a specific reason that they have behind that. We'll get more into the specifics of that later. What you need to know now, right, is that definition. So make sure to write that down somewhere, as well as that there are two types of appropriations, two types of spending. There's mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Okay, we're going to talk more about those in a second as well too. So before we get into the different types of spending, we have to talk about the budget. So a budget, right, is how much money you have to spend during a specific time. So the US federal government and state governments as well too, they all have budgets, right? They all have a specific amount of money that they can spend within a given year. All right. That money comes from taxes. It comes from us, right? It comes from the people, right? People make money and they pay taxes. Those taxes go to the government, and then the government decides on how to spend them. I have an example of a budget here. This is my budget for $1,000. This is how I would spend $1,000. This is probably not the greatest way to spend it, but this is how I do it. So I would have to spend, right, $300 in student loans, $200 in car loans, $100 in gas, $300 at B-dubs. Do not ask. I like chicken wings. It just be like that sometimes, right? But the government has to do the same exact thing as well too, right? They have to take their money that they get from taxes and decide where it goes to. Sometimes the government has to spend on certain things, and other times they get to choose where that money goes. So Mr. Chairez has to spend money on student loans and on my car loan. I don't have a choice, right? I have to spend that. That's what we would call mandatory spending with the federal government. And then the other two, right, gas and B-dubs, I get to choose those. That would be known as discretionary spending. Let's get into it, right? So mandatory spending, make sure to write this down. You got to know what mandatory spending is. So here's the definition that you could write down or put this in your own words. By law, the government has to spend a certain percentage of the budget on specific entitlement programs. So what this means is that in the United States law and in specific state laws, there are certain programs that the government has to spend a certain percentage of the budget on, no matter what, right? So no matter if a specific person in Congress or in the government say they don't like Social Security, they don't want to spend it, doesn't matter what they like, right? We have laws that say certain percentages of the budget have to go to certain programs, right? And you could see, take a look at the bottom right hand side. So this is 2019, this is last year's mandatory spending breakdown, right? So 38% of the budget that went towards mandatory spending went towards Social Security, 23% went towards Medicare, 60% went towards income security, which is like disability, and 15% went towards Medicaid, which is another healthcare system, and then 4% went towards benefits for veterans, and then another 4% went towards other various things. So these programs here that we see on the right, these are what's known as entitlement programs, right? Which means that the government has to spend money on these legally. They are bound to spend money on Social Security, Medicare, income security, Medicaid, veterans benefits, and a few other things, right? So this is by percentage. The government does not decide that they want 1 year to spend 38%. This is dependent on how many people are eligible or entitled to money in that program. Okay, so if you take a look at our examples, this little old lady, looks like she's having a wonderful time because she's getting Social Security benefits from the government, which is great because she's entitled to that due to her age. Now, if you look at other people as well too, right, so she might also be entitled to Medicare due to her age as well too. The government has to pay for her because she's entitled. So there's a few certain programs that the government has to spend. The majority of the budget goes towards mandatory spending, right? But then we get into discretionary spending, and this is where the government decides on what programs to spend on. So this is where they have a decision. So once they pay out to all of the mandatory spending, Everything that's left is considered discretionary spending, right? Which means that the government gets to decide on where this money goes based on specific reasons. So this is where we actually get into appropriations, or how the government appropriates its money into different programs, right? This is where they get a choice, okay? So make sure not to confuse this with mandatory spending and appropriations, right? Appropriations is discretionary spending, right? It's what we get when they get to choose. Mandatory, they do not get to choose, okay? So when we're looking at discretionary spending, take a look at the bottom right at this chart. This is federal discretionary spending for 2019. This is also for last year. So you can kind of see the breakdown of where the discretionary budget is going into. So you can see one really interesting thing, right, is that the majority of the money in discretionary spending goes towards the military. About $730 billion in 2019 went towards funding the military, which is a government program. 53% of the budget went there, right? And then we could see another 90 billion, 70% went towards funding the government, right? So running the government, paying out government and salaries and things like that. Then we have housing and community, right, which is like public housing, veterans, health, education. This one might be important for us, right, because me and you are both in education, right? So the government spends about 5% of its discretionary spending on education, right? So there's a lot of these different things, right? So some examples, I just went through them, right? The military is where most of our money goes to in discretionary spending, right? About 5% goes to education, right? So that goes to both public education in the high school and lower levels, as well as college education, right? So when I went to college, I got federal aid. So the government gave me money to go to college. That comes out of this budget as well too. And then this other picture is farming, right? So agriculture is also a sector in which you can see here food and agriculture, about 1%. Funding goes there as well too. So the interesting thing about discretionary spending is that the government, Congress, right, which is part of the government, has to come together and they decide where this money goes. And a lot of the times they can't decide, right? Because as you would imagine, liberals and conservatives have different priorities and they want money to go into different places. So it's always a big deal every year on deciding the budget, and it takes weeks and weeks for them to come to an agreement. So here are some examples. I know I kind of went through them already, right? But one example that's really relevant to us is education. So spending on education, how much the government decides to spend. So we get funding from the government, right? Because we're an educational institute, and the resources that you guys have, right? So let's say, for example, like if you get free and reduced lunch, that comes from the government spending. If you have a Chromebook, which you do, that's paid for by government spending, right? I'm paid for by government spending. Okay, so your teachers are as well too. The building, the lights are on at Leiden, which means that it is being paid for by government spending, right? So all of that money comes out of discretionary spending. Another example you can see here on the right is military expenditure, and this is an interesting graph. This is all the way back in 2010, right? But I believe this number has gone up. But this is the top 10 shares of world military spending. So you could see all of the military spending for these top 10 countries in the world, 42% of that comes from the United States. We spend the most money on the military than any other country in the world, which is pretty interesting to think about, right? So that's where the majority of our money goes to. Now, right, might conservatives and liberals have different ideas about where the majority of the money would go? Absolutely. I would say conservatives probably would want more security, right? So they would be more in favor of spending there, right? Whereas liberals might be more in favor of spending on different programs. Here are some positives and negatives, right? So one of the big positives, right, is that the government, right, is able to fund things and is able to fund public programs and to help citizens and try and help solve our problems with money. That's a big positive, right? When we look at the negatives, right, one of the big negatives is that we have to pay a lot in taxes, right? We have to pay money in order for these programs to be funded. That's where the government gets their money from, is taxes, right? So again, liberals and conservatives, right, have different ideas about this, right? Conservatives would probably not want to spend a lot in they wouldn't want to pay a lot in taxes, and they would prefer people to keep their money and to help themselves with their own money. Whereas liberals would probably prefer to pay more in taxes if that means that there are more government programs designed to help people. So that's just a little bit about appropriations. Make sure to do the reading as well too. And yeah, that's it. Feel free to go back and watch this video, take any notes. I am done. I will talk to you soon.